Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Jason. Good to see you.
Chuck, as somebody who's a former naval officer, specifically someone who's a squadron leader in Navy SEAL Team 6, you've spent a lot of time in the water. And these days, a lot of people are talking about what is necessary to have interdiction of the Russian Ghost Fleet. Is it realistic? Do we have the capacity to do it? Why aren't we doing it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Russia has various estimates between 400 and 1,400 uh, ships, bottoms, we say, in its Ghost Fleet. And these range from very large crude carriers, which are 1,000 feet long, to coastal lighters, which are, 100 feet long. Quite a big estimate. They are registered in places, flags of convenience, Panama, Liberia, Gabon, that great naval power, Malta, Cameroon, Palau, I think you see where I'm going, Cyprus, and some vessels actually still registered in Russia. They frequently flag hop with one of their vessels, the Barbados, has changed flags 10 times since 2013. Okay, and they are held by corporations, shell corporations, trusts, uh, all sorts of disposable corporate entities. The This makes it hard to get a hold of them in terms of civil litigation. However, stopping these ships is definitely within the capability of the naval special warfare elements of most NATO nations. And if you take all of the SEAL teams, the Kampfschwimmers, all of the naval special warfare elements of all of NATO, you could wrap up the entire Russian shadow fleet in a 2-week operation globally. Every one of these vessels can be seized and taken over. Is that going to happen? Well, the Finns decided that it would happen. One Russian ghost vessel dragged her anchors across Finnish telecommunications cables, and they got visited by fast roping Finnish policemen who took the ship over, and it is still anchored off Helsinki harbor. So it definitely can happen. Should it? Just recall me to active duty, and I'll be happy to take a couple myself.
So, why doesn't it happen? And when you are trying to interdict a ship, what's necessary? What's the process for that?
Well, it's a sort of a complex dance. The ship is located by aerial platforms or space-based platforms. The SEAL team has a capability to reach any target in the world. I won't tell you the number of hours, but we can definitely get it done before anyone asks if we've done it yet. One of the techniques is a C-17 opens its back doors, and we parachute out with our high-speed assault vessels. These are basically like stealth cigarette hull, fast, capable ocean racing boats, and they will meet the ship and affect the boarding and take it over. It's something that SEALs practice constantly. The time to hook, we call when you've got the boarded on the ship, to being in control of the engine room, secondary steering, and the bridge. It is literally a matter of a very small number of minutes. One of the things that would make this operation easier is a lot of the Russian fleet is concentrated in a few areas around the world. Around Malaysia, they tend to lager up in large anchorages. They do this to trade their oil at high points in the fluctuation of the price. And the Greeks may discover that this is going to be happening in the Aegean, which is another place in Greek territorial waters, a NATO nation, that the Greeks watch this oil being transshipped, ship to ship, pumped over the side to one ship, into another. This is a very risky environmental problem. And one of the things that is an outfall of these Russian ships changing registration, flags of registry. They're not insured. The mariners that man them, their licenses are out of date. And if you think that's not a problem, would you get on an airliner with a guy whose license wasn't up to snuff or never had one? So,
So
but this is something that could definitely happen. Absolutely.
So it is pretty amazing when it's so obvious that Russia has a serious weakness in their economy. They're totally dependent on oil. In fact, it used to be historically in the 90s and before that it was often 50% of national budget. Today it's only about 30%, but still 30% is a pretty large part of the sector. And what's interesting is that there's two countries specifically that are importing most of the oil, more than 35%. They're India and they're China. And what's interesting about India and China both is that we've seen recently that though they've pledged to be good friends of Russia, they don't seem to have a lot of interest in facing the sanctions that might come with that. In fact, secondary sanctions on Chinese banks have already created ripples in the Chinese economy. China's economy, as you know, has had a lot of setbacks. Already this year alone, there's been serious injections of capital by the central bank. They've lowered the reserve ratios, and they face a lot of other problems. So China's got its own set of problems. But what's even more incredible, to put this into perspective, actually, let's look at this. Donald Trump put in a 145% tariff on Chinese goods. As you know, the Chinese began talks with the Americans and Switzerland to lower those, and it looks like they did lower them. But that's 145%. Seems drastic. The new sanctions being proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham is that anyone who buys Russian oil would be facing 500% tariffs. So just imagine that. Keep in mind, total trade with the EU and the US is a massive part of both the Chinese as well as the Indian economy. That's about 40% in both cases. Versus dealing with Russia, it's less than 4% in both cases. So Russia might be a nice partner to have, but it's nowhere near the level of partnership that India and China need to keep their economy going. Such heavy tariffs or sanctions coming from the US would absolutely wreck their economies. And the Chinese, North Indians, I think, are willing to take that risk. Rather, they'll leave the Russians with their surplus of oil sinking and with too much oil and not able to do anything with it. But going ahead, from a military standpoint, what other things could the US be doing right now to be supporting Ukraine that we're not actively doing, specifically in the economic warfare area? For instance, boarding the ships or doing other things that we could do to slow down the Russian military.
Well, the lowest hanging fruit is actually interdicting their ghost fleet. These are soft targets. No one's going to put up a fight, or if they, the fight is going to be extremely one-sided. Because the United States needs to do things with a legal precedent. You have that operations are called VBSS, visit, board, search, and seize. You can visit these ships on the high seas to see if they are in compliance with the shipping regulations, right? Your mariner, your chief engineer, your masters, your mates, are they licensed? No. Is the vessel insured? No. Does it have the latest safety of life at sea gear? These are pretexts upon which these visits can be made. The other thing that can happen is you simply get the nation of Greece to exert its sovereignty and prevent some of these transfers that happen. A great many of them happen in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Aegean. That's one thing that can absolutely happen. But as you and I were talking before we went on tonight, if inflecting the Russian economy is the most vital military, it will have the most vital military consequences. You are up on the economic numbers, but if you can unplug Russia's ability to make money on a national level, you are going to immediately inflict their ability to wage war in Ukraine. So I'm going to throw the question back to you. What do you see the most viable means to carry that out?
There's a lot of different things we could do, and we've chosen not to do, incredibly enough. Unfortunately, under President Biden, there was often this talk of creating World War III or how can we avoid Russian civilians being hurt. And I give an example of something absurd, which they prevented. There was a desire to make sure that there would no longer be lubricants for engines within Russia. And one of the reasons that the Biden administration opposed doing that was they said, well, normal people in Russia also use cars. We don't want that to happen to them. And why that was such an easy industry to target is that one of the compounds, one of the chemicals used in creating those lubricants came from factories in France and factories in China, two specific factories in China. So it was something that could have very easily been targeted by the Americans had they wished to. Now imagine that engines seizing up because they simply do not have the lubricant necessary. But there's a desire not to do that because they didn't want normal Russian civilians to suffer. To me, that's absurd. Because, yes, the Russian civilians may not be able to use the bus or the cars, but guess what? It also means that Russian tanks are not able to run. And that's sort of the objective here. Everything we've done so far is just enough to help Ukraine, but not enough to win. And there's things that we could do very clearly economically to really put pain on the Russians. There is a lot of money that goes through for the super yachts, for instance, which easily, because it's going through the SWIFT system, we could stop that money. We can, the United States that is, can make sure that that money does not reach its final destination by asking simply, where did it come from? Show me that it's illicit funds that taxes were paid on. And even though it's Russian money, the US can freeze it. Speaking thereof, there is money that's frozen. In fact, hundreds of billions of dollars of money that's been frozen, which we could have already taken and given to Ukraine to arm itself, so it could pay for its own weapons if it wished to. Unfortunately, the United States and the Europeans have been slow to do so out of a fear, an irrational fear that one day perhaps a court will rule against us and we'll have to pay them back. The reality is that's not going to happen. There's a criminal regime. The Russian Federation is filled with criminals who have tons of money outside the country, including the government of Russia has tons of money outside the country. That money could be frozen and given over to Ukraine. And it's totally legitimate given that the regime in Russia is an illegitimate regime and they have no way to justify the finances that they have. But going ahead, let's look at what happens next. The Europeans do look like they are getting more serious about supporting Ukraine. And finally, they are coalescing around different things, not just the sanctions, not just cutting off from SWIFT, various Russian banks that they've talked about now, but also helping them militarily. What do you think are the key things that Ukraine needs right now militarily to be supported with?
Well, we're in this weird period of time right now. As we speak, it's about 8:30 at night in Kyiv. Russia apparently did not respond to the deadline today, which was engage in negotiations today or face the consequences tomorrow, which will be in a couple of hours here, Ukraine time. Uh, One of the things that Ukraine needs desperately, and I say this every time we talk, they need air defense complexes sufficient to negate Russia's war on Ukrainian cities. Through every truce, ceasefire, pause of negotiations, ongoing negotiations, Russia has maintained its ongoing attacks on Ukrainian centers of civilian populations. Look, that's a war crime. That's right out of, when you take a Caliber cruise missile and you target it on an apartment building to hit it on the fifth floor, that is a war crime. That's going on even now as we speak. Last night, Ukraine shot down 50 Shahed drones. That wasn't even a big night as far as a Russian assault goes. So getting Ukraine's air defense, right now they've got limited resources. They group them on cities. Even highly mobile systems like the Gepard, like the Croatow, which should be at the front protecting Ukrainian positions, and more importantly, protecting Ukrainian battlefield logistics, front-end logistics, they're not there. They can't do it. Up their air defense and face it, let's give them what they need to conduct large-scale ground maneuver operations that liberate territory. And still, by the way, Russia is in the middle of losing this war. They are never going to get to the Dnipro. They lose a battalion of men every day. They lose 4 battalions of artillery every day. They're delivering T-62 tanks to the front yard. And look, that's back when Elvis was skinny and JFK was president. Russia's not winning and they can't win. But we got to make sure Ukraine can win.
So, at this stage in the game, if you're a Ukrainian soldier looking at what's happening, you must be frustrated that there's a lot going on. The Americans know that more could be done, and they choose not to do it. At the same time, there is one good thing that we do see happening, which is that the U.S., aside from giving weapons, also gives intelligence. And I've always understood, and tell me if I'm wrong, because you are the expert, is that one of the things that's helped save Ukrainian lives so far, aside from the long-range weapons and all the other weapons, as well as the defensive weapons, is the fact that we give the intelligence that helps the Ukrainians to know where the Russians, for instance, are starting to coalesce so that they can then strike those positions to prevent them from being able to attack. As there's many fewer Ukrainians than there are Russians, keep in mind, free Ukraine's total population is probably about 23 million. Russia's population is about 140 million. So Ukraine cannot afford to lose a lot of lives. It simply cannot afford to. And the Russians are obviously just throwaway lives left and right. They don't care about their soldiers. But at the same time, isn't this something that works in tandem? It's the intelligence sharing and not simply the weapons that's helping to protect Ukrainian lives, and why the United States should continue sharing this intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was an egregious unilateral intelligence pause put out by Washington. In that 10-day pause, Ukraine found itself in very difficult straits in Kursk Oblast. Without the adequate warnings, without the lead up time, without the target selection from orbital platforms, Ukraine found itself at a disadvantage because, again, Russia has numerical superiority. One of the most important things is, and that Ukraine has developed the ability to do this. With good intelligence, Ukraine does not have to be strong everywhere, but it has to be mobile and they have to be able to concentrate at the point of Russian attacks. And what allows you to do that is having pre warning, seeing the indicators and warnings of a coming Russian attack. And Ukraine is also lucky in that Ukrainian valor and Ukrainian leadership greatly exceeds what's on the other side of the zero line. The Russians have terrible leadership, terrible morale, undertrained soldiers, and therefore they always attack at 10 o'clock in the morning. They can't attack at night. They come and they come dragging 4-kilometer long dust clouds behind them, giving the Ukrainians time to converge at the point of attack and deal with it. But you're right, intelligence is key to that. The other thing is Ukraine still has artillery hunger, right? Artillery is the principal arm of the Soviet ground forces, and Ukraine needs more shells to put out more volume of fire and more counter battery solutions. But when they inflict 4, 5, 6, 7 battalions of artillery losses on the Russians every day, look, that's some good shooting. And I'm not even an artillery officer.
So the Russians are taking a beating. Now, do you think that their officers at this point realize how bad it is? Or do you think that they still have a hope that there's a strategy that's going to come through any day now, which will allow them to take Kiev? How do you think that they're perceiving the situation?
There's so many anecdotal video evidence of Russian soldiers complaining that their officers aren't at the front, that they don't care, that they keep doing the same things over and over and over. And we see this constantly. Every time the Russians stage an attack, they lose between 30 and 80% of the attacking force. Sometimes, in some occasions, up in Kupiansk, they've lost 100% of the attacking force. Two battalion sized elements operating in concert were wiped out within 20 minutes. That is because the Ukrainians knew they were coming, where they were going, saw them coming, and then to compound this comedy of errors, the Russians bifurcated their assault force, put a swamp between the two elements, made them no longer mutually supporting, and they were annihilated by Ukrainian artillery and drones. This is not just a vacuum of leadership. This is the kind of leadership you get when your army for the last 20 years has been a giant grift machine, right? Where you bought your promotions, you get promoted up so you can sell the stuff that's under you. It isn't an army anymore. And the other thing is, I constantly say, Russia is never going to win this war. They can't win it with the army they have. These guys aren't soldiers and scholars like you see with General Mick Ryan or General Ben Hodges, men who've devoted their life to military science and geopolitics. Not just tactical brilliance, but a sense of a wider world. No officers fill this role in the Russian armed forces, and why should they? Like I said, this has been a mob family, not a military. and this is good for Ukraine, but we need to give Ukraine what the U.S. Army would require if it were operating in Ukraine. One of those things is air superiority. Ukraine is nowhere close to providing that. There are steps that can ameliorate that deficit, but the U.S. in particular needs to give more.
So we've talked about air superiority before, but actually, why don't you expand on that for those who don't understand? Why is that so critical for an army to have air superiority?
Well, you always want to be able to clamp a lid uh, over what it is you're trying to protect. In this case, it would be Ukrainian cities, but also the ground lines of communication and supply for your armies. And air superiority is something that the United States always has, but that is sort of like saying, you're absolutely at the top of the pyramid. Air superiority means if it flies, it dies, right? You're going to shoot it down with your F-22s, your F-35s. You've got total air control. Then there are different gradations. There's like air parity, where both sides have sort of an equal chance. Then there is a localized air dominance, where you're not strong everywhere, but you're strong where you need to be at certain times. Ukraine's Air Force started out, practically demolished. And rebuilding Ukraine's Air Force, even though the F-16s are getting there, and even though other fighters are joining the fight, it's going to be a generational process to build up Ukraine's Air Force. And this is a decades-long process to take an Air Force in disarray with multiple different patterns and bring them up to the position where they can reliably defend their sovereignty in the air. That means you cross the border, we're going to eat your lunch. Of course, Ukraine doesn't have that right now. And over the battlefield, in terms of daily airstrikes, Ukraine might get off 20 aviation strike missions or close air support missions a day. The Russians frequently go over 100. And with everything that is Russian, they're not attacking Ukrainian military targets. They are attacking apartment buildings in Kramatorsk, in Chasiv Yar, you name it. They're aiming at apartment buildings.
Absolutely the case. Chuck, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, Jason. Talk to you soon.